Hello and welcome to the ultimate guide to Star Wars character creation. In this video we are going through all the steps you need to go through to make a character that could be a believable part of the Star Wars universe. There is quite a bit that goes into it, so let's get started. The first thing on the list is your character's profession and status. And this is something that is very important to establish from the beginning, since it will dictate a lot of the following steps. There are plenty of different professions to choose from in the Star Wars universe. Maybe your character is a farmer, or a pirate, or a senator, a pod racer, a bounty hunter, or why not, the bartender at the local cantina. The possibilities are really endless and you can get really creative with it. What their profession is will also determine their status in the society that they're living in. Or in case your character doesn't really have a profession, you should still determine what their status would be. So essentially, do they come from a poor, rich or middle class background? The second thing is the time period. This is also an important step to determine in the beginning, since it can have a pretty big impact on your choices in future steps. But this part itself is pretty straightforward. You just have to choose what time period you want your character to be in. There's plenty of options and they all offer different possible directions for your character to go into. For example, if you want your character to be a soldat, depending on the time period you will have different options available. For example, if it's during the prequel era, maybe your character is a clone or another part of the Grand Army of the Republic, or maybe they are from a separatist-aligned planet fighting against the clone army. Or if it's during the reign of the Empire, maybe your character is enlisted in the Empire, or they could be part of the rebel forces. These are obviously maybe the more generic time periods, but there are some other options as well. You could go with the Old Republic, the High Republic, or something in the transition periods, so to speak, so just after the fall of the Republic or the Empire. But if you choose to make your character a bit more distant from the main events in the Star Wars universe, maybe they live on a backwater planet and never really leave. The time period is not going to affect too many things, but it is still good to have at least some sort of idea what time period your character exists in. And if you want more freedom with coming up with a story surrounding your character, you could also go with a time period that isn't really explored yet. So let's say 100 years before The Phantom Menace or 700 years after Return of the Jedi. Then we come to the appearance of your character. Here, mainly what you have to think about is the species. There are plenty of species to choose from, as you probably know, but here it's also good to keep in mind the profession of your character and what time period they are from. For example, if you want your character to be a Night Witch from Dathomir, but the story is set during the Imperial era, that might not work out because at that point pretty much all Night Witches were wiped out. Or if your character is an Imperial officer, you can't make them any other species than human if you want them to actually fit into the rest of the Star Wars universe. But in general, almost anything is possible, and if you're unsure about the history of a species, you can look them up on Wikipedia and follow the sources and find out more about them. The next step is to choose your planet. Something to keep in mind here is that a lot of characters in the Star Wars universe travel around. They might originally be from another planet, but they just live somewhere else, either because of their job or because they couldn't stay at their home planet for various reasons, or then they left willingly in search of adventure. These are all things that you can use as parts of your character's backstory, and they can be important parts of what shapes their life. But anyway, when it comes to choosing the planet your character is from, you have to consider the previous steps. Depending on what time period you chose, some planets might simply be off limits, like Alderaan after Battle of Yavin. I don't think I need to say more about that one. And then depending on the profession, some planets might simply not work for the profession you want them to have. Let's say you want them to be a moisture farmer. Then Camino might not be the best planet to go with. I mean, there's plenty of moisture, but who's gonna buy it? Then of course, if your character is another species other than human, let's say Trandoshan for example, you're probably going to want them to be at least originally from Trandosha, which is the home planet of Trandoshans, if that wasn't obvious enough. But again, this is something that depends on the species. Some are very widespread across the galaxy and don't necessarily have to be born on the planet that their species is originally from, while others are rarely seen outside of their home planet. And again, if you're unsure about a specific planet or its population, you can always look it up. Or if you feel like it, why not make up a whole new planet? Then the next step is the clothing. This step heavily relies on your previous choices. Some professions in specific times have a set outfit, like for example an Imperial officer or any other Imperial job for that matter. And if your character is a mercenary or a bounty hunter, they probably want to wear something practical. And if they have a more mundane job, their status in the society that they live in will affect the way that they dress. And when it comes to style and color, the planet they are on will affect that, because it really depends on what kind of materials they have available there and if it's a rich or poor planet. If they are a senator, they are probably wearing some fancy clothes that somehow represent the planet that they are from. And if they are a poor person living on a hot and sandy planet, they are likely to wear some well-worn clothes that still protect them from the sand and the heat. You really just have to think about your character based on their status, job, and where they live, and then find something that feels realistic to their conditions. And then we have weaponry. And first you have to decide if your character has a weapon. They might not need one if they come from a peaceful planet and their job doesn't require one. And of course, if they are a Jedi, Sith or other Force user, they are likely to have a lightsaber. But if they are not a Force user and they need a weapon, you have plenty of options to choose from. If they are some other species than human, you could also look into weapons that species traditionally use. Otherwise, again, depending on the time period and the profession, you might either have a lot of options or very little options. For example, if your character is a royal guard from Alderaan, you'll more than likely go with a DH-17 blaster pistol. And if you have a very specific character like this example, it will be fairly easy to find out what weapon you should be using. But if your character is a bounty hunter, for example, there are plenty of options when it comes to blasters. You'll just have to research different options and find something that you like and something that would make sense for your character to have. And of course, it doesn't have to be a blaster either. There are other types of weapons too, such as blades or knives or staffs or flamethrowers. Next up is the ship. And that is, of course, if your character even has a ship. Most normal people in the Star Wars universe don't own their own ship. Either they can't afford it or they just don't need one. But if you think your character needs a ship and it would make sense for them to have one, then you should once again look back at your previous steps to figure out which ship would be good for them. You have to think about the time period because certain ships you just won't come across at certain points in time. And of course, if the planet that your character is from has their own specific types of ships commonly used, then it would maybe make sense for your character to also have something similar. Here it could be a good idea to look up characters from your planet of choice and see what kinds of ships they are using. Then another thing to keep in mind, once again, is the profession. Do they need something fairly big so that they can transport or smuggle goods? Or do they just need something you can use to quickly get from place to place? The next step is thinking about their companions, or sidekicks, or whatever you want to call them. Are they like Jabba and have their own pet? Or do they have a droid that helps them out in their daily lives or on their adventures? It is a good idea to base this choice on what your character would realistically need and what would be available for them to get. Let's say they own a shop for spare parts and they live on an unsafe planet. So maybe they need something to make sure nothing gets stolen. And maybe that planet was once occupied by separatists and perhaps they found a B1 battle droid laying around, which they then reprogrammed and now use as security for their shop. Then we have the second to last point, which is backstory and personality. I have these in the same point since it can be a good idea to figure them out simultaneously because they kind of go hand in hand. Their past experiences shape who they are, and their personality shows through in the ways they handle the obstacles that they have faced in their lives. If you're struggling with this point, go back to the previous steps and think about each of these things and how the choices you made shape the character that you're creating. The choices you made in the previous points all tell a story. Your character is already done. Now you just have to ask the right questions to uncover the character that you created during this process. What does the profession they are in tell about them? And how did they end up in that profession? What is their attitude to whatever it is that they are doing? Their weapon of choice. How did they end up with it and how do they feel about it? Basically, ask yourself a lot of questions about the character and what their views are on the world that they're living in. The final step is the name. You might wonder why I've left it to last, but there are some pretty simple explanations to that. First of all, the name isn't that important to the rest of the process. Second of all, once you have fully established your character, it is easier to pick a name that suits them. And lastly, there is a set of methods you can use to very quickly and easily come up with names that sound like they could come straight out of the Star Wars universe. And lucky for you, I have made a video just about that, so check it out if you want to Star Warsify your names. Until next time, bye bye.